The millionaire mocked the waitress.
Make him walk and I'll pay you $5 million.
But when she accepted the challenge, what she did left everyone completely pale with shock.
Come on, my love, you can do it.
Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Marcello's Italian restaurant, casting golden rays across the mahogany tables. Sarah Mitchell had been working there for 3 years, ever since her mother's medical bills had become too overwhelming to ignore. She moved between tables with practiced grace, her white apron slightly stained from the lunch rush, her tired smile never wavering despite her aching feet. At 30 years old, she had become accustomed to the weight of responsibility, her mother's health, her own uncertain future, the crushing reality that she would likely spend her entire life serving others at tables instead of sitting at them. The restaurant was quieter now, in that liminal space between lunch and dinner. Only a few tables remained occupied. Sarah was clearing dishes from a corner booth when she heard the distinctive sound of an expensive sports car pulling up outside. Through the window, she watched a man emerge. Tall, impossibly handsome, with the kind of casual confidence that only came from generational wealth. He wore a designer suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and he carried himself like someone who had never been told no in his entire life. James Whitmore III entered the restaurant with his young son Marcus in a state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair. The boy was 5 years old, with his father's sharp features and intelligent dark eyes. But unlike his father's easy stride, Marcus's small body was trapped, his legs useless since birth due to a rare degenerative condition that no doctor had been able to cure or even slow. James loved his son with a fierceness that sometimes frightened him. It made him vulnerable, and James Whitmore had spent his entire life avoiding vulnerability. "Table for 2, James announced to the hostess, his tone suggesting that the restaurant should be honored by his presence. Sarah watched as they were seated near the window, the best table in the house, naturally. She picked up their menus and approached, her customer service mask firmly in place. James barely glanced at her as she placed the menus down. He was too busy adjusting Marcus's position in his wheelchair, checking that his son was comfortable, that the angle of the table worked for him. There was tenderness in his touch, despite his otherwise dismissive demeanor toward the staff. Sarah had learned to recognize this kind of father, the ones who were gentle at home but cruel everywhere else, as if they could only afford kindness in limited quantities. "Water, no ice," James said without looking up, "and Marcus will have apple juice. Make sure it's organic." "Of course," Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral. She'd heard worse. What happened next would change both their lives, though neither of them could have known it. As Sarah turned to leave, Marcus accidentally knocked over his water glass, spilling it across the white tablecloth. It was a simple, childish mistake, but James's reaction was shocking. He didn't comfort his son or brush off the accident with a laugh. Instead, his face darkened and he grabbed Marcus's small wrist with surprising force. "You're so useless," he hissed, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. "Can't walk, can't even hold a glass. What good are you?" Sarah froze. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down his small cheeks. The boy tried to pull his arm away, but his father held firm, his jaw clenched with anger that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded within him. Sarah's professional mask cracked. She had grown up with a mother who loved her fiercely, who had sacrificed everything. She had never heard such cruelty directed at a child, especially not by a parent. Something in her core rebelled against what she was witnessing. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Sir, let him go," she said quietly, but her voice carried an authority that made James look up in surprise. For a moment, they locked eyes. James's anger shifted, transforming into something else. Indignation, perhaps, that a waitress would dare address him. He released Marcus's wrist, though whether from Sarah's intervention or because he'd made his point, she couldn't tell. "This is none of your business," James said coldly. "Just bring the drinks." But Sarah didn't move. Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze remained steady. That little boy didn't choose to be born with his condition, and he certainly doesn't deserve to be spoken to like that. No child does. The restaurant had gone quiet. Other diners were pretending not to notice the confrontation, but everyone was acutely aware of what was happening. James's face flushed with anger and humiliation. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone in a service position. He leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with new interest. Not attraction, but curiosity, mixed with contempt. "You think you know something about my son?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you could do better?" "I think I could treat him with basic human decency," Sarah replied. James laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound that held no humor. "Do you know who I am?" "James Whitmore. My family owns half of this city. I have more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes, and in all my wealth, with all my resources, I still can't fix my son. I've taken him to every specialist, every research hospital, every experimental treatment in the world. Nothing works. Nothing ever will." He paused, leaning forward with a cruel smile spreading across his handsome face. "So here's a challenge for you, since you're so full of opinions. You cure my son, you make him walk again, and I'll give you $5 million. $5 million, enough to change your entire life." The words were clearly meant as mockery. James expected Sarah to be flustered, to apologize, to slink away. Instead, she set down her notepad with deliberate care. "I accept," she said simply. The silence that followed was absolute. James stared at her, his cruel smile faltering. "What?" "I said I accept your challenge," Sarah repeated, her voice steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. "I will cure your son, and you will give me $5 million. James's laugh returned, louder this time. "You're insane." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but I accept." She turned and walked away, leaving James staring after her with an expression of mingled disbelief and something else, something that looked almost like hope, though he would have vehemently denied it. What neither of them knew was that Sarah's acceptance of that impossible challenge would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately transform them both. The universe had just set a test in motion, and neither James nor Sarah would ever be the same. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her small apartment, the same one she'd lived in for 5 years, with its water-stained ceiling and temperamental heating system, and replayed the confrontation over and over in her mind. She had been reckless, impulsive. She had let her emotion override her common sense, and now she'd made an impossible promise to a man who clearly despised her and who would use her failure as another opportunity for cruelty. But there was something else too, a stubborn, determined part of her that had already begun working. Sarah had spent the night researching Marcus's condition online, scouring medical journals and case studies, looking for any thread of hope, any possibility she might have overlooked. The condition he suffered from, progressive spinal muscular atrophy type 3, was indeed rare and degenerative. Most children with it never walked. Many didn't survive to adulthood. The prognosis was bleak. But there was one case study from a clinic in Switzerland, a holistic treatment center that combined physical therapy, specialized nutrition, herbal medicine, and something called neuroplasticity training. It was experimental, unproven by mainstream medicine, and it had only shown results in 2 cases out of hundreds. Still, those 2 cases had shown remarkable improvement. One child had regained partial use of her legs. It was a thread. A thin one, but it was something. Sarah called the restaurant early the next morning and asked to speak with the manager. When he came on the line, sounding irritated, she made her request. "I need to speak with James Whitmore. Do you have a contact number for him?" "Sarah, what is this about?" Her manager sounded confused. "Did something happen yesterday?" "No, nothing. I need to contact him. It's important." The manager, who had worked at Marcello's long enough to know not to ask too many questions about the wealthy customers, provided her with a number. Sarah called it 3 times before she had the courage to actually go through with the call. When she finally did, she reached an assistant. "Whitmore Residence," a crisp, professional voice answered. "Hi, yes, I'm calling for James Whitmore. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I worked at Marcello's yesterday, and One moment, please." She was put on hold. Sarah paced her small apartment, her free hand gripping her coffee mug so tightly she thought it might shatter. "This is James." His voice was different on the phone, colder, more businesslike, but underneath she detected something that might have been curiosity. "Mr. Whitmore, it's Sarah, the waitress from yesterday." There was a pause. "I remember. Coming to apologize?" "No," Sarah said, surprising herself with her directness. "I'm calling to discuss your son's condition and my plan to help him." Another pause, longer this time. "You're serious?" "Yes." "Why?" Now there was genuine confusion in his voice. "You don't know me. You don't know my son. You don't know anything about his condition. What possible reason could you have for doing this?" "Because someone needs to," Sarah said simply. "Because your son deserves better than to be told he's useless. Because I believe that miracles happen when people are willing to do the impossible work." She heard him exhale slowly. "You're delusional." "Maybe," Sarah acknowledged, "but I'd like to try. I have an idea. A clinic in Switzerland that's had some success with cases like Marcus's. I want to work with him, implement some techniques I've read about. It's a long shot, but it's something. Do you have any idea how much money I've already spent?" James's voice was sharp now, angry. "The best doctors in the world, the most expensive treatments. Nothing works." "I know," Sarah said quietly, "but maybe what Marcus needs isn't another doctor. Maybe he needs someone who believes in him unconditionally, someone who doesn't see him as broken." The silence stretched on so long that Sarah thought he might have hung up. "Come to my house tomorrow at 10, he finally said. "Bring whatever research you have, but I'm telling you now, if you're trying to scam me or if you're some kind of religious fanatic with faith-healing nonsense, I will end this immediately and make sure you never work in this city again." "I'm neither," Sarah said. "I'll be there at 10. She hung up and sat down on her bed, her hands shaking. What had she gotten herself into? The next morning, Sarah stood in front of the Whitmore mansion, trying not to feel completely out of place. The house was enormous, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens, a fountain in the circular driveway, and staff members who looked like they'd been trained to judge people on sight. A uniformed woman answered the door and led her through marble hallways to a study where James was waiting. He looked different in his own home. Less polished, somehow. More real. He was wearing casual clothes, an expensive sweater and tailored pants, and his hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd run his hands through it recently. There were dark circles under his eyes. "You came," he said, as if he hadn't quite believed she would. "I said I would." He gestured to a chair opposite his desk. On the desk was a thick folder. Marcus's medical history, she assumed. "Show me what you have." Sarah spent the next 2 hours explaining everything she'd researched. The Swiss clinic's methodology, the case studies, the theoretical basis for why a combination of intensive physical therapy and neuroplasticity training might work when traditional medicine had failed. She spoke with passion and knowledge, and she watched James's expression shift from skepticism to something approaching consideration. "This clinic," he said finally. "Costs about $150,000 a month. I know because I've looked into them." "Then you already know they're legitimate," Sarah said. "But they've never taken a case as severe as Marcus's. They work with children who already have some function, some hope. Marcus's condition is degenerative. Even if they were willing to try, even if everything you're saying is true, we might be buying a false hope that will only hurt him more." Sarah said, "we might be giving him a chance that he didn't have before." James stood and walked to the window, his back to her. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Why are you doing this?" he asked without turning around. "And don't give me the answer you gave me on the phone. Tell me the truth." Sarah considered lying. It would be easier. Instead, she told him the truth. "Because I grew up with a mother who was sick for most of my childhood. And I watched people give up on her. Doctors told her to accept her condition, to stop fighting. But she didn't give up. She fought every single day, and she won. She's healthy now. And I learned from her that sometimes the thing that saves you isn't medicine or money. It's someone believing in you when you can't believe in yourself." James turned to face her, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression that she hadn't seen before. "And if we fail, if we do all this and Marcus gets worse, then we'll have failed together," Sarah said. "But at least we'll have tried." He studied her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. "I want you to start working with Marcus tomorrow, full-time. I'll pay you $50,000 a month plus expenses. I'll have you brought into the house daily. You'll work with physical therapists, nutritionists, anyone you think might help. But I'm telling you now, if at any point I think you're hurting my son or wasting our time, I will end this immediately." "Understood," Sarah said. "And Sarah?" He said her name with something that might have been respect. "Don't make me regret this." As she left the house that day, Sarah felt the weight of what she'd committed to settle on her shoulders. She had made a promise to an impossible challenge, and now she would have to deliver. The first week was the hardest. Sarah moved into a small cottage on the Whitmore estate, a staff quarters that was nicer than her entire apartment, and threw herself into Marcus's care with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. She woke before dawn to review research, spent hours on video calls with the Swiss clinic specialists, and worked with Marcus for at least 6 hours every day. The physical therapy was intense and, at times, heartbreaking. Marcus cried often, his small body struggling against exercises that pushed him beyond what he'd known was possible. But Sarah was patient with him in a way that James was not. Where James saw his son's limitations as personal failures, Sarah saw them as challenges to overcome. She celebrated every small victory, a twitch that hadn't been there before, improved muscle tone, better control. "You're so strong," she would tell Marcus over and over. "Stronger than most grown-ups I know. You're going to walk again. I know it. And I'm going to be here with you every step of the way." James watched from the periphery at first, suspicious of Sarah's methods, convinced that she was deluding his son with false promises. But as weeks turned into months, he began to notice changes. Marcus's muscles were becoming more defined. His posture was improving. The light in his eyes had shifted. Instead of the resigned sadness that had characterized his expression before, there was now hope. It was during the 4th month that James first spoke to Sarah about something other than Marcus's condition. They were in the kitchen late one evening. Sarah had been working with Marcus since 6 a.m., and it was now past 9 p.m. She was preparing a special smoothie, part of the nutritional protocol they developed, when James appeared, holding 2 glasses of wine. "You should eat something," he said, offering her a glass. "Dinner was hours ago." Sarah accepted the wine, surprised by the gesture. "I will, after Marcus goes to sleep." "He's already asleep, and Mrs. Chen prepared dinner hours ago. It's in the warming drawer." Sarah felt a flutter of something in her chest. This was the first time James had acknowledged that she might need caring for. "Thank you." They sat at the large kitchen table, and for the first time, James asked her questions that had nothing to do with Marcus. "How did you end up working at a restaurant? It doesn't seem like it's what you wanted to do." "Life has a way of determining your path for you," Sarah said carefully. "My mother got sick when I was 17. Her medical bills were astronomical. I needed money, so I worked. And then I needed more money, so I worked harder. And eventually, it just became my life." "What did you want to do?" James asked. Sarah hesitated. She'd never told anyone this. "I wanted to be a nurse or a therapist, something where I could help people. But nursing school was too expensive, and I had my mother to support." James was quiet for a moment. "I could have paid for it," he said finally, "if you'd asked. For the nursing school." "I don't know you then," Sarah pointed out. "You know me now." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Sarah set down her wineglass, suddenly very aware of how close they were sitting, how the kitchen light caught in James's dark eyes, how his expensive sweater somehow made him look more vulnerable, not less. "I can't accept that," she said quietly. "Why not?" "Because it would change things. What we're doing with Marcus, it's working because it's pure. Because I'm not doing it for money or advancement or any ulterior motive. I'm doing it because I believe in him." "And you don't believe in yourself?" James asked. "Don't you deserve the same?" Before Sarah could answer, they heard a sound from down the hall. Marcus calling out in his sleep. James stood immediately, and Sarah followed him to Marcus's room. The boy was having a nightmare, thrashing against his sheets, crying. James gathered him in his arms, speaking softly to him, and Sarah watched the transformation that happened when James was with his son. The armor fell away, the cruelty disappeared. What remained was a man who loved his child more than anything in the world. She slipped out of the room quietly, but not before James looked at her, gratitude clear in his expression. That night, Sarah lay in her small cottage and thought about James Whitmore. He was still arrogant, still emotionally damaged in ways that would take years to untangle, but she was beginning to see the man beneath the wealth and the anger, and that man was becoming harder and harder to ignore. The next months passed in a blur of work and small, intimate moments. Sarah and James began to have dinner together after Marcus went to bed. They would talk for hours about Marcus's progress, but also about deeper things. James told her about his childhood, about a father who had valued wealth above all else, who had taught James that love was weakness. Sarah told him about her mother's illness, about the fear and the struggle, but also about the triumph of her mother's recovery. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted between them. The work with Marcus continued to progress. By the 8th month, Marcus was showing remarkable improvement. His legs, while still weak, had begun to respond to stimulation. He could move his toes now, could bend his knees. The doctors were baffled. Some wanted to study him, others dismissed the progress as statistical anomaly. But Marcus kept improving. And as Marcus improved, James's feelings for Sarah became impossible to hide. It happened one evening in the garden. They had taken Marcus outside to do his exercises. He loved being in nature, loved the feeling of the sun on his face. Sarah was working with his legs, doing the stretches and movements that had become routine. James was watching from nearby, as he always did, but this time he wasn't watching his son. He was watching Sarah, the way she moved with such grace, such patience, the way her face lit up when Marcus achieved something new, the way she had become, in just a few months, the most important person in both their lives. That night, after Marcus was asleep, James found Sarah in the library, where she often spent her evenings reading. "I need to tell you something," he said, closing the door behind him. Sarah's heart rate accelerated. She knew what was coming, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. "I promised myself I wouldn't do this," James continued. I promised myself it was inappropriate, that it would complicate everything, but I can't lie to myself anymore. James, Sarah started, but he held up a hand. I'm falling in love with you, he said simply, and I think you might be falling in love with me too. But I need to know if you feel the same way, or if what you feel for me is just gratitude for the opportunity I've given you. Sarah stood and walked to him, and she looked up into his face, seeing the vulnerability there, the hope and fear mingled together. I feel the same way, she said quietly, but I'm terrified, because this changes everything. It makes what we're doing with Marcus more complicated, and because you're so far outside my world that I can't imagine how this could actually work. You will make it work, James said, and he took her hand, unless you don't want to. I want to, Sarah admitted, but what about Marcus? What if Marcus loves you, James said, almost as much as I do, maybe even as much as I do. He won't care if we're together. If anything, it will make him happy. And then James kissed her, and Sarah understood in that moment that her life had just changed irrevocably. She was no longer the poor waitress who worked at a restaurant. She was a woman loved by James Whitmore. And somehow, against all odds, she was in the process of curing his son. The next morning, Marcus noticed the way they looked at each other and grinned. Are you going to be my mom? He asked Sarah innocently. James and Sarah exchanged a glance. Maybe someday, James said, pulling Sarah close. If your mom wants to be. Marcus clapped his small hands together in joy. Yes, yes, please. Ooh. And Sarah, looking at the man beside her and the child she had come to love as her own, realized that the impossible cure she'd promised wasn't just about Marcus's body. It was about healing all three of them, about proving that love could do what medicine alone could not. 8 months into Sarah's work with Marcus, the boy was making progress that had all the specialists mystified. He could now move both his legs, though with difficulty. He had spent a full hour in a standing position with support, something that had seemed impossible just months before. The trajectory of his recovery was unprecedented, but not everyone was celebrating. James's brother, Edward, had been absent for most of the past year, traveling, ostensibly on business, but actually avoiding the complicated feelings he had about his nephew's condition. Edward had always blamed James for Marcus's illness, had suggested that James's destructive lifestyle before marriage had somehow caused the child's genetic condition. It made no sense, of course, but Edward had never let logic interfere with his resentments. When Edward returned, he brought with him news that shattered the fragile happiness James and Sarah had built. "There's a woman who claims to be your ex-wife," Edward said coldly, standing in James's study with his arms crossed. "She's been looking for you. She says she has documentation proving that you were still legally married when you started your relationship with this waitress." James's blood went cold. "That's impossible. I divorced Margaret 5 years ago." "Did you?" Edward's smile was cruel. "Or did she divorce you? Because apparently there's a gap of 3 years where the paperwork was disputed. It was never fully resolved, and legally she's still claiming to be your wife." Sarah, who had been standing near the door, felt the room spin. "What does that mean?" "It means," Edward said, turning his gaze to her with obvious contempt, "that your relationship is not legal, that any relationship you've built here is built on a lie, and it also means that Margaret is planning to use this information in her custody battle for Marcus. She's going to claim that James is unfit, that he's been conducting an inappropriate relationship with household staff while still technically married, and she's going to take Marcus away. "Margaret abandoned Marcus when he was 2 years old," James said, his voice shaking with rage. "She couldn't handle having a disabled child. She ran off with a tennis instructor to Bali. She hasn't seen Marcus in 3 years." "I know," Edward said, "but the law doesn't care about that. And she has money, she has lawyers, and now, thanks to Sarah here, she has ammunition." After Edward left, James paced the house like a caged animal. Sarah tried to comfort him, but he couldn't bear her touch. "This is my fault," Sarah said quietly. "If I hadn't come into your life—" "Don't," James said harshly. "Don't you dare blame yourself. This isn't your fault. This is Margaret's fault. This is the fault of a system that allows a mother who abandoned her child to still have claims on him." But underneath his anger, Sarah could see the fear, the real possibility that they could lose Marcus. The next day, Margaret appeared at the house. She was beautiful in an icy, sculpted way, the kind of beauty that had been achieved through surgery and personal trainers and dermatologists. She wore designer clothes and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had always gotten what she wanted. She brought with her a lawyer who was equally cold and efficient. Marcus, when he saw his mother, didn't recognize her. He had been so young when she left, and in the years since, James had done his best not to speak badly of her, but he also hadn't kept her memory alive in the house. Margaret's face crumpled slightly when she saw that her own son didn't know her. "Marcus, sweetheart," she said, moving toward him with what was clearly meant to be a warm smile. "It's Mommy. Don't you remember Mommy?" Marcus looked at James, confused. James placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is your biological mother, Marcus. You haven't seen her in a long time." "Are you going to take me away?" Marcus asked Margaret, with the directness of a child. Margaret's lawyer put a hand on her arm, signaling her to be careful. "We're going to talk about what's best for you," Margaret said carefully. The legal battle that followed was swift and brutal. Margaret's lawyers argued that James was unfit, that he had been conducting an inappropriate relationship with household staff, that he had been negligent in his duties as a father, that Marcus needed the stability that only a mother could provide. They suggested that Marcus's recent improvements were due to Margaret's genetic contribution, not to any treatment or therapy, and that with proper medical care from specialists in California, where Margaret was now living, Marcus would continue to improve. James hired the best lawyers money could buy, but he was deeply afraid. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He moved through the house like a ghost, and Sarah watched him deteriorate day by day. "We should tell them about the cure," Sarah said one night. "We should present Marcus's progress, the improvements, all the documentation." "They don't care," James said bitterly. "They see a woman they can use against me. They'll argue that everything you've done is experimental, unproven, potentially dangerous, and they'll argue that I put my relationship with you ahead of my son's well-being." "But you didn't," Sarah protested. "That's what matters," James agreed. "But will they believe it?" 3 weeks before the custody hearing, something unexpected happened. Marcus had a breakthrough. He stood up, completely on his own, without support, without Sarah holding his hands. He took 3 wobbly steps and then fell into Sarah's arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Sarah held him, overwhelmed by the moment, and then she called James. He came running from his study, and when he saw what his son had done, he broke down completely. He gathered Marcus in his arms and sobbed, not from sadness, but from relief and joy and the vindication of what Sarah had promised him so long ago. "You did it," James whispered to Sarah. "You actually did it." "We did it," Sarah corrected. The video of Marcus walking became the centerpiece of James's defense. Combined with testimony from the Swiss specialists, from the physical therapists, from independent doctors who had studied Marcus's case, it painted a picture of a child making an unprecedented recovery thanks to an innovative treatment protocol and the dedicated care of a woman who had believed in him when no one else did. The judge was impressed. More importantly, Marcus himself was impressive. In the hearing, when asked if he wanted to live with his mother or his father, Marcus was clear. "I want to stay with Daddy and Sarah. They make me better. They love me. I want to stay with them." Margaret tried to argue that he was too young to understand, but the judge overruled her. In the end, the judge found in James's favor, though he did mandate that Margaret have visitation rights and that James maintain the treatment protocol that had been so successful. After the hearing, Margaret approached Sarah in the courthouse hallway. For a moment, Sarah thought she might apologize or try to mend things. Instead, Margaret's face twisted with contempt. "You think you're special," Margaret said. "You think you've won, but you've just become bound to a man with a sick child. That's your entire future now, and when he gets bored with you, when he decides you're no longer useful, he'll discard you like he discarded me. Because that's who men like James are, and you're too naive to understand that yet." Sarah didn't respond. She simply turned and walked away. But Margaret's words lodged in her mind like a splinter. She had been so focused on Marcus's physical cure that she hadn't fully considered the deeper reality of her relationship with James. Was it real? Or was it just gratitude and proximity, the natural result of spending so much time in close quarters with someone who was grateful? That night, she told James she needed to move back to her own apartment. "What?" He looked at her as if she'd slapped him. "Why? Sarah, what did Margaret say to you?" "Nothing that I didn't already know," Sarah said quietly. "James, we need to step back. We need to figure out if what we feel is real or if it's just the intensity of what we were going through together." "It's real," James said immediately. "I love you. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." "But how do you know?" Sarah asked. "How do you know it's not just that I'm the woman who cured your son, that I'm not just useful?" "Because I know," James said, frustrated. "Because I've felt it every day since that moment in the kitchen. Because you're the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about when I fall asleep. Because I can't imagine my life without you in it." "I need time," Sarah said. "I need to live my own life for a while, to figure out who I am outside of your world." "Sarah, please, I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. But she packed her things and moved back to her small apartment that night. For 3 weeks, she didn't speak to James. She picked up extra shifts at the restaurant and tried to convince herself that what she had done was the right thing. But every night, she thought about Marcus, about his progress, about whether she was hurting his recovery by removing herself from his life. And then, one evening, as she was leaving the restaurant, she found James waiting outside in the rain. He was soaked, his designer clothes ruined, his hair plastered to his forehead, and he looked more vulnerable, more real than she'd ever seen him. "Marcus took 6 steps today," he said without preamble. 6 steps on his own, all the way across the room. "And he asked for you. He cried because you weren't there." "James," Sarah started. "I'm not asking you to come back because of Marcus," he continued. "I'm asking you to come back because I love you, because I want to spend the rest of my life with you, because I want to marry you and have children with you and grow old with you. And I promise you, on everything I hold sacred, that I'm not just grateful, I'm in love." Sarah looked at this man she had challenged, who had challenged her in return, who had grown and changed through the force of their connection. And she realized that Margaret had been wrong. James wasn't going to discard her. He was asking her to stay. "Okay," Sarah said simply. "Okay, yes." They kissed in the rain outside the restaurant, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that her life would never be the same. 6 months later, the little cottage on the Whitmore estate hosted a wedding. It was a small affair, just close friends and family, with Marcus as the ring-bearer, walking down the aisle with only minimal support from James. The sight of the 5-year-old boy moving on his own 2 legs, with strength and stability that grew more impressive each week, moved many of the guests to tears. Sarah wore a simple white dress and carried flowers from the estate garden. When she said, "I do," She was thinking not just about James, but about the promise she had made, both to him and to his son, when she'd accepted that impossible challenge at a restaurant so many months before. As his wife, Sarah was finally able to pursue the nursing degree she had always dreamed of. James set up a trust fund for it, and she began attending college part-time while continuing to work with Marcus. The boy had become her greatest joy, not just because of the medical progress he was making, but because he was a real person with his own personality, his own sense of humor, his own strength. Marcus was now walking consistently, though he still had the gait of someone recovering from severe physical limitation. But the doctors agreed that his progress was nothing short of miraculous. The Swiss clinic wanted to study his case extensively, to write papers about the treatment protocol that Sarah had developed with them. Universities reached out, asking her to consult on cases, but with success came a complication that Sarah hadn't anticipated. The rumors started small, whispers at James's business gatherings that Sarah wasn't who she claimed to be, that she had somehow manipulated James into believing his son was improving, when in fact Marcus's recovery was the result of alternative, unproven treatments that were dangerous, that she was a gold digger who had seduced a vulnerable man while he was emotionally weak over his disabled son. The media picked it up, always hungry for a scandal involving wealthy families. There were articles with headlines like "Gold Digger to Billionaire" and "Miracle Cure or Medical Fraud." Some claimed that Sarah had learned how to exploit James's emotional vulnerabilities. Others suggested that she was a con artist who had researched Marcus's condition specifically to gain entry into the Whitmore family. James was furious. He wanted to sue, to fight back, to prove that Sarah was legitimate. But Sarah understood something that he didn't, that fighting the narratives would only fuel them further. "Let it go," she told him. "People are going to believe what they want to believe. We know the truth. That's what matters." But the accusations gnawed at her. Were they right? Had she manipulated James? Had she fallen in love with him because he was rich? Because he could provide the security she'd always lacked? The questions that Margaret had planted came back, louder now, amplified by the media scrutiny. It was while she was sitting in the library one evening, doubting everything, that James found her. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, without preamble, "something I should have told you a long time ago." Sarah's heart rate spiked. She thought he was going to tell her that Margaret was right, that his love for her wasn't real, that it was all just gratitude and convenience. "I hired a private investigator," James said. 3 months after you started working with Marcus. I wanted to know if you were genuine. I wanted to make sure you weren't some kind of con artist or gold digger trying to get access to my money." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. "The investigator looked into your background, your finances, your family. And you know what he found?" James continued. "He found exactly what you told me, a sick mother that you supported, medical bills that bankrupted you, a small apartment and a minimum wage job. He found a woman who had sacrificed everything for the people she loved, and he found absolutely no evidence that you were anything other than exactly who you claimed to be." "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah asked. "Because it felt like a betrayal," James said. "Because I was ashamed that I had doubted you. Because by the time the investigator's report came back, I had already fallen in love with you, and I knew that the truth about my initial suspicion would hurt you." Sarah sat with this information. James had doubted her, had investigated her, but he had ultimately chosen to believe in her. And then he had been honest about his doubt. "I need to show you something else," James said, pulling out a folder. Inside was documentation of every expense James had paid for Sarah's mother's continued medical care since Sarah had started working at the house. Specialists, medications, a full-time home nurse, James had quietly ensured that her mother received the best care available. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do this?" "Because she's your mother," James said simply, "and because I love you. And because I wanted to know, once and for all, whether what you're doing with Marcus is real or whether it's a performance. And I discovered that it's real. You're real. Your love for my son is real. And your love for me, I believe, is real too." "It is," Sarah whispered. "I'm sorry I doubted it. I'm sorry I let Margaret's words get into my head." "Don't apologize," James said, pulling her into his arms. "Just promise me that we'll face whatever comes next together. Whatever the media says, whatever people believe, we know the truth about us. And that's all that matters." The next week, Sarah gave an interview to a major news outlet. She spoke about Marcus's condition, about the treatment protocol, about the hard work and dedication it had taken to help him progress. She spoke about James, not as a man who had hired her or manipulated her, but as a father who loved his son so much that he was willing to try anything, believe anything, to save him. And then she did something that surprised everyone, including James. She donated the money from the interview to the Swiss clinic, ensuring that other families struggling with degenerative conditions could access the treatment protocol that had worked so well for Marcus. "What did you do that for?" James asked after the interview aired and the donation was announced. "Because it was the right thing," Sarah said simply. "Because this was never about money for me, and because people needed to see that." The media narrative shifted after that. Instead of a gold digger, Sarah became a hero, the woman who had cured a billionaire's son, the former waitress who had used her kindness and intelligence to achieve the impossible. The donations rolled into the clinic. Other families reached out seeking help. And most importantly, Marcus continued to improve. By his 7th birthday, he was walking without support. By his 8th, he was running. The doctors used words like unprecedented recovery and medical miracle. Sarah got her nursing degree. James, with Sarah's encouragement, started a foundation dedicated to funding research and treatment for rare childhood conditions. And more importantly, James became a better father. The cruelty that had characterized him before, the impatience with his son's limitations, the occasional lashing out, disappeared. In its place was a man who had learned that love meant acceptance, patience, and belief. One evening, as Sarah and James were putting Marcus to bed, the boy asked a question that brought tears to both their eyes. "Do you remember when you first came to our house?" Marcus asked Sarah. "When I didn't know you." "I do," Sarah said, tucking the blanket around him. "I'm glad you came," Marcus said simply. "I love you." "I love you too," Sarah replied. After they turned off the light and left Marcus's room, James took Sarah's hand. "He's going to be okay," James said. "He's going to be more than okay. He's going to have a full, healthy life because of you." "Because of us," Sarah corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you." "No," James said, stopping and turning to face her. "You could have. You would have found a way. That's who you are. Someone who makes the impossible possible. Someone who believes in miracles even when everyone else has given up." He kissed her then, and Sarah understood that the real miracle wasn't Marcus's physical recovery. It was that two people from completely different worlds had found each other, had grown together, and had built something beautiful and real from an impossible challenge. The cure had never just been about Marcus's legs. It had been about healing all of them, about proving that love, when it was true and pure and believed in with absolute conviction, could do what medicine alone could not. 3 years after Sarah had accepted James's impossible challenge in that restaurant, life had settled into a kind of beautiful rhythm that Sarah sometimes had to pinch herself to believe was real. Marcus was now 8 years old, and he attended a regular elementary school where he was not treated as a disability, but simply as a kid who had been sick and got better. His teachers were astonished by his intelligence and his resilience. Other children gravitated toward him because of his warmth and his infectious laugh. The boy who had been told he was useless had become beloved. Sarah and James had purchased a larger house, not the Whitmore mansion, but a beautiful home on the coast with gardens and open spaces where Marcus could run and play without feeling confined. They had 3 bedrooms, and the third one Sarah had quietly prepared for a baby. She was pregnant, 6 months along, and though she had wanted to wait a little longer before telling James, her morning sickness had given her away. Now, as she stood in the nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. "You're glowing," James said, appearing in the doorway with a glass of lemon water, the only thing Sarah could keep down these days. "I feel like I'm glowing and swelling and retaining water in equal measure," Sarah replied, but she smiled. "How was your meeting?" "Productive," James said. "We found 4 new research leads for the foundation. And the clinic in Switzerland wants to expand. They're asking if you would be willing to consult on the expansion, maybe even do some teaching." "I'd like that," Sarah said, "though I'm going to be a little busy for a while." James set down the water and came behind her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, one hand settling gently on her swollen belly. Their baby kicked, as if greeting his father. "I'm so excited," James whispered against her hair. "I couldn't have imagined 3 years ago that I'd be here, that we'd be here." "Even on the day I accepted your challenge?" Sarah asked. "Especially on that day," James said, "though I thought you were absolutely insane." Sarah laughed. "I thought so too. I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew that I couldn't stand by and let that beautiful boy be told he was worthless." "You're an extraordinary person," James said. "I've told you this 1,000,000 times, but I need you to really hear it. You're extraordinary, and I'm so grateful that you challenged me that day, and even more grateful that you stayed." That afternoon, Marcus came home from school with a painting he'd made for the nursery. It was bright and chaotic, a family of stick figures with flowers and hearts, and the sun shining down on them. It was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever seen. "That's us," Marcus said proudly, pointing at each figure. "That's you and Daddy and me and the baby." "It's perfect," Sarah said, hugging him. "We're going to put it right above the crib." That evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, she received a phone call. It was from the Swiss clinic. The director of the facility was calling to inform her that her protocol had been approved for full medical research and that she had been invited to be the lead researcher on a grant-funded study. "We want you to understand," the director said in his Swiss-accented English, "that what you've accomplished with Marcus Whitmore is nothing short of revolutionary. The combination of neuroplasticity training with intensive physical therapy and nutritional support, it's changing how we think about degenerative conditions. You could transform medical science." After hanging up, Sarah sat down at the kitchen table and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization of how far she had come. 3 years ago, she was a waitress wondering how she would pay her rent. Now she was a nurse, a researcher, a wife, and soon to be a mother. And none of it had happened by accident. It had happened because she had believed in an impossible dream. That night, Sarah did something she hadn't done in years. She called her mother. "Hello, sweetheart," her mother answered. Her voice was strong now, no longer weakened by illness. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm going to be leading a research study. It's a big deal. I'm finally doing the kind of work I always wanted to do." "I know you are," her mother said, and there was pride in her voice. "I've always known you would do something extraordinary. I told you that when you were little. Do you remember? I said, 'Sarah, you're going to do impossible things,' and you are." "I love you, Mom," Sarah said. "I love you too, baby, and I'm so proud of the woman you've become." After they hung up, Sarah went upstairs to find James reading in bed. She climbed in next to him and rested her head on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "The clinic called," she said. "They want me to lead a research study on my protocol." James set down his book and tilted her chin up to look at him. "That's incredible. You're incredible." "We're incredible," Sarah corrected. "None of this happens without you. Without your willingness to believe, to take a chance on a crazy waitress who promised to cure your son." "You didn't cure him by yourself," James said. "You cured him by believing in him. And maybe that's all any of us really need. Someone who believes in us completely and unconditionally." "Is that what I did for you?" Sarah asked. "Among other things," James said, kissing her forehead. "You gave me back my son. You gave me back myself. You showed me that love doesn't have to be conditional or guarded, that it can be open and fierce and absolutely transformative." The next morning, Sarah woke early and went for a walk on the beach near their house. She was thinking about Marcus's painting, about the way he had drawn their family, all together, all safe, all loved. She was thinking about the journey from that restaurant where she had made an impossible promise to this moment, where the promise had been kept in ways she could never have imagined. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Ms. Sarah Mitchell Whitmore. This is Dr. Catherine Reynolds from Johns Hopkins University. I've been following your research on neuroplasticity treatments for degenerative conditions. I believe your protocol could revolutionize our understanding of childhood muscular dystrophy. Would you be interested in a conversation about a potential collaboration?" Sarah smiled. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of timing. Just when she thought she had achieved everything she could achieve, new doors were opening. She texted back, "Absolutely. I'd love to speak with you." And as she continued her walk, feeling the sand beneath her feet and the ocean breeze in her hair, Sarah thought about the impossible things. She had promised to cure a man's son. She had delivered. But more than that, she had cured a family, had healed wounds that ran deep, had transformed a man filled with anger and pain into someone capable of love. 3 months later, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl, Emma Rose Whitmore. James was present for the birth, and the first person he called after confirming that mother and baby were healthy was Marcus. "You're a big brother," James told his son. "She's beautiful, and she looks like your mom." Marcus came to the hospital the next day, and Sarah watched as her son, the boy who had been told he was worthless, who had fought so hard to reclaim his life and his body, met his baby sister. He was gentle and tender with Emma, and Sarah saw in his eyes the same quality she'd seen in James, deep, unconditional love. "I'm going to teach her to walk," Marcus said solemnly, "because I know how important it is." That night, as Sarah held Emma in her arms while James slept in the chair beside the hospital bed, she thought about promises. She had made one impossible promise 3 years ago, and it had led to this, to a daughter, to a complete family, to a life beyond her wildest dreams. But more than that, it had proven something fundamental about human nature, that belief can create miracles, that love can cure what medicine alone cannot, that when you give everything to help someone else achieve the impossible, the universe has a way of giving back tenfold. Emma opened her eyes and looked at her mother, and Sarah felt the full weight of the responsibility she had taken on, not just to cure Marcus, but to raise a child in a world full of challenges and possibilities, to be the mother she had always wished for, to be the partner James deserved, to be the researcher who would help other families find their own impossible cures. "I promise," she whispered to her daughter, "that I will always believe in you. I will always believe in what you can become, and no matter how impossible things seem, I will never give up on you." The sun was rising over the hospital as Sarah made that promise, and she realized that the real miracle, the thing that could truly transform the world, was not the cure itself, but the belief that a cure was possible, that with enough love, enough dedication, enough absolute conviction, anything could be healed. Even the broken places in a man's heart, even a child's damaged body, even a life that seemed to be heading toward a predetermined, limited future. Everything was possible. She had proven it. And now, with Emma in her arms and her family asleep around her, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that she had truly, completely transformed 3 lives by refusing to accept the impossible as impossible. The cure was complete, and the family was whole. Emma was 5 years old, the same age Marcus had been when Sarah first came into their lives. She was clever and precocious, with her mother's determined nature and her father's sharp mind. Marcus was 13, walking and running and doing all the things the doctors had said would never be possible. He had become an advocate for children with degenerative conditions, working with his mother at the foundation to help families navigate diagnosis and treatment. Sarah had become a renowned researcher, published in major medical journals, invited to speak at international conferences. The protocol she had developed with the Swiss clinic was now being implemented in hospitals worldwide, and the results were astonishing. Children who would have been confined to wheelchairs were learning to walk. Families were being given hope. But the greatest achievement in Sarah's mind wasn't the research or the accolades. It was the family she had built. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, all 4 of them, plus James's mother, who had become a regular visitor, Sarah looked at each face and felt a sense of completeness that transcended anything she had accomplished professionally. "I have an announcement," James said, catching everyone's attention. "Sarah has been selected to receive the Nobel Prize in Medicine for her work on neuroplasticity treatments for degenerative conditions." Emma gasped. Marcus grinned. James's mother wept, and Sarah, looking around at the faces of the people she loved most in the world, felt the full circle of her journey. From a waitress with nothing to a woman who had changed medical science. From a woman doubted and investigated to a woman celebrated and respected. From a stranger to a family member, a wife, a mother, a researcher, a miracle worker. "I wouldn't be here without all of you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "None of this happens without James believing in me, without Marcus being the strongest, most courageous person I know, without Emma reminding me every day why we do this work, so that children can have full, healthy lives, without the support of everyone around this table." "You did this," James said, taking her hand. "You made the impossible possible. I just had the good sense to believe in you." Later that night, after Emma and Marcus were asleep, Sarah and James sat on the beach where she had taken that walk years ago. On the morning she learned about the Johns Hopkins opportunity. "Do you remember," James asked, "the day you accepted my challenge? You said you would cure my son." "I did," Sarah said, "and I was completely terrified." "You hid it well," James said, "but I want you to know something. In all the years since, I've never doubted you. Not really. Even when you doubted yourself, I never doubted that you could do what you promised." "Why?" Sarah asked. "Because the moment you stepped forward to defend my son, I saw who you really were," James said. "I saw a person capable of moving mountains, a person who believed in the impossible so fiercely that you could make it real." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence, watching the waves. 5 years ago, she had been a waitress wondering how she would make it through the month. Now she was a Nobel Prize winner, a renowned researcher, a mother, a wife. The impossible had not only become possible, it had become her reality. "I love you," she said to James. "I love you," he replied. "Thank you for accepting my challenge. Thank you for believing in my son. Thank you for becoming my wife and the mother of my daughter. Thank you for being exactly who you are." As the sun set over the ocean, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would never stop believing in the impossible. She would never stop fighting for children and families who had been told that their situations were hopeless. And she would spend the rest of her life proving that with enough love, enough dedication, and absolute conviction, miracles were not just possible. They were inevitable. The cure had transformed not just Marcus, but all of them. And that, Sarah understood, was the greatest miracle of all.